And I would like to now invite the next speaker. We have with us Powsell-Jones. Powsell-Jones is with Gartner. He'll give us a perspective of the market in the enterprise space. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to give you a slightly different perspective on a slightly broader theme than Pierre's introductory remarks. I'm going to share with you some results of some research we've done on enterprise CIOs across Asia Pacific. And I'm hoping to leave you in the next 15 minutes or so with a broader appreciation of the sorts of issues and the sorts of concerns and priorities for that group. Now, of course, it's an average, and of course, Asia Pacific, many different countries have many different things, but I hope you'll be able to see some patterns appearing in the data. And I'd like to start the ball rolling by describing a brief history lesson and describe how 2010 is different to 2009. What you have building on the slide behind me and off to the sides here is the increase year on year of enterprise IT budgets. So what this says is back in 2007, globally budgets were growing by about 3.1%. Here in Asia Pacific they were growing a little more than that, 3.8%. Not a big number, but nevertheless it's growth. Similar story in 2008. Then something terrible happened in 2009. Globally, we saw enterprise IT budgets actually being cut for the first time since we've been doing this survey for the last 10 years by about 8.1%. Essentially, globally, last year eliminated 3 years of growth of IT budgets. Here in Asia Pacific, we were slightly better than that, only a cut of about 4.6%. But what that meant was there was less money available and people focused more carefully on what they were spending money, and that was true across the whole of the Asia-Pacific region. I'd like to put something in context here which was said earlier. Print costs at 1 to 3% or 5%, whichever analyst you want to listen to. Imagine if we could reduce our print costs to 0. That would have more than eliminated that deficit number there. We also saw much more interest last year in as a service because something scary happened. Enterprises suddenly discovered they couldn't scale their IT costs when their business volumes collapsed. Suddenly IT looked incredibly expensive last year because we could not shrink when the market shrank. And I think that, more than anything else, is focusing people's attention on as a service, of which, by the way, managed print services is but one very good example. Essentially trying to break away from a high capital intensity. But how does 2010 shape up? Well, it's an altogether much more positive story. Back to growth. Globally, 1.3%. A miserable number, but nevertheless it's positive. But here in Asia Pacific, we're seeing a much stronger growth. So there's much more money available across the region to spend on information technology. What are our enterprise CIOs doing with that money? What are they accountable for? What is the job of a CIO, an enterprise CIO in Asia Pacific? Well, I'm going to share with you some top 10 priorities. You'll see a couple of these charts. The geography is all the same. There'll be a list of things down the left-hand side of the board, and you'll see some time series data across the top. And at the extreme right-hand end, I'm contrasting Asia-Pacific against the rest of the globe. And this is the list. In fact, I'll do the whole build because it's not a... In fact, I will do the whole build, thank you. Essentially, this is the top 10 list of things that enterprise CIOs across Asia-Pacific say they're worrying about. What are the surprises in this? Well, actually, there aren't too many. 2010 isn't that different. The job of the CIO, the enterprise CIO, has not changed. It's still about driving business performance. It's still about making business processes better. It is still about reducing enterprise cost. Essentially, and if you were listening to Pierre's comments earlier about MPS, Managed Print Services, a large number of the messages and the things that Managed Print Services does are actually enshrined in the things that is the CIO's job. How do I make business processes more efficient? How do I reduce the costs of my enterprise? Well, let me take a little detour and answer a question. What does business process improvement really mean? I'm going to share with you just one example, a different case study company. Sloan Valve is a privately held, middle-sized US manufacturer of valves, a global corporation. Tom Coleman is their CIO and Chief Process Officer. And Tom's view on business process improvement is this, and this is what we really mean by business process improvement. There must be some measurable business outcome. If you're a logistics company, it might well be you're delivered in full on time. It might be the amount of working capital I have tied up in my business, how quickly I can come to market. Or it might be your ability to innovate and introduce new services. So if you imagine that's the vertical axis on this chart. Businesses go through a series of different innovation cycles. They go through imagine this is a staircase. There's the flat part of the stair, and the riser, then another flat part, and then the riser. MPS, Managed Print Services, is essentially an example of process redesign. We're taking a radically different view of how certain processes are done. This is essentially the job of the enterprise CIO. It's to choose the right tools and respond to the right opportunity. After you've done that, after you've made that step change in performance, you then go into a period of continuous innovation. Something that, by the way, in this part of the world we are phenomenally good at. Now, what Tom's advice to enterprise CIOs, as an enterprise CIO himself, is this. Choose the right tools. Choose business process if you have a business process problem. Choose tools like Lean or Six Sigma or any of those other tools if you have a continuous improvement problem. And I would argue that Managed Print Services is one of those business process change tools, provided you view it in the right context. So what we've heard already today fits very strongly into the things that ultimately enterprise CIOs are being held accountable for. So what do those enterprise CIOs say they're going to be doing in 2010? Well, this is where I'm going to show you this next chart. You're now familiar with the geography. It's the same list. It's the same time series. It's the same rest of the world data. So you're now familiar with the layout of this. But the question we ask is slightly different. It says, well, what are you going to spend your time on, Mr. and Mrs. or Ms. CIO, for 2010? How does that differ to previous years? The answer is, again, surprisingly little difference. It's all about delivering projects that make a difference, a measurable difference in terms of growth. It's all about linking business and IT, in other words, making investments and doing planning that bring about appropriate levels of value. It's about reducing the cost of IT. And remember I said earlier about the issue of IT suddenly started looking phenomenally expensive last year. But there is actually something slightly different. Let me just pick on that first point here, delivering projects that enable business growth. Jargony, awful phrase. What does it really mean? The nature of projects has actually changed quite substantially over the last 12 months. And if you'll forgive me the analogy to the Lunar New Year that has just passed. Last year we saw enterprises across the region focusing on a much smaller number of larger projects that involved information technology. What that meant was the companies, because they were undergoing substantial cost reduction, they found themselves having to focus much more acutely on one or two major projects because they're the ones that created value. And what that meant was there was an awful lot of other projects that were being left undone. So if you like the metaphor of the Lunar New Year, 2009 was the year of the one single 800-pound gorilla, a big project. 2010 is different. 2010 we are seeing many more smaller projects, of which, by the way, all nature of innovation, many more strategic projects are now being undertaken this year because more money is available. So if you like the metaphor of the one 800-pound gorilla last year, 2010 is the year of the 800 one-pound monkeys. IT has an execution risk problem. CIOs have an execution risk problem. This next data chart simply looks at why projects fail. But rather than go through the detail of it, What enterprise CIOs face in 2010 is an exaggerated level of execution risk in the diversity of the projects they're undertaking. What that means is they are worried. They are worried about how they're going to deliver all this stuff. They're going to worry about how to make it work. Pierre mentioned the Magic Quadrant from Gartner. The significance of the Magic Quadrant is it rates vendors by their ability to execute and their completeness of vision. It is our belief as Gartner that companies that are in the top right-hand quadrant are in general less risky and better able to help you than companies elsewhere in the Magic Quadrant, because that's why we produce the Magic Quadrant. If 2010 is the year of execution risk, I would suggest strongly take a look at the Gartner Magic Quadrant and choose vendors that are in the top part of that, the top right-hand box, of which, by the way, Hewlett-Packard is a good example. That's why, by the way, this is relevant today. But the question that's often asked is, gee, you know, all this IT stuff, is it now entirely historical? We've done all the great innovation, right? Well, it's interesting. What constitutes a killer application is not going to be the next whizzy gadget, the iPad notwithstanding, of course. It's going to be an application of something that probably already exists. And coming back to the thing we are incredibly good at in this part of the world, frugal innovation, reverse innovation. We take ideas and make them work at phenomenally lower cost, at far greater reach than the Western economies have ever been capable of doing. Has information got a role to play in that? You bet. Has managed services got a role to play in that? Of course it does. The data behind me is simply a different survey. It was a survey of CXOs, CEOs, CFOs, asking them what they thought the future of IT. And as you see, year on year, it's been getting brighter and brighter. It simply says the bigger the number, the more strategic contribution IT is seeing. But the nature of that contribution has changed. It's not a single breakthrough idea, it's not a killer application, but it's a killer idea. And it's a killer application of ideas that already exist. In other words, it's taking a mature set of technologies and applying this very innovative thinking. And again, I'll refer back to some of the things Pierre talked about. That managed print services is another great example of a very mature application of ideas to existing technologies. So, in summary, enterprise CIOs, what are they really trying to achieve? And this board behind me, this 5 bullet points, attempts to average together all of those averages. Many of them, or most of them, are seeking to position their IT organizations as perceived partners, bringing ideas to the enterprise, which is why, by the way, interesting things like managed print services, it's an idea the enterprise would probably never have got to on its own. That is the value of the IT organization, bringing new techniques. Demonstrating IT value proposition to the business. I mean, for goodness sake, this is fundamental to enterprise efficiency. How can I radically reduce the cost of my business processes? How can I take that, whatever that percentage is, 1%, 5%, out of my business processes? How can I make my business processes more secure? Raising collaboration across the enterprise, within the enterprise. It's a #1 priority for CIOs across the region. Now, what Pierre touched on very briefly and will be talked on a bit later, I understand, is a product from HP called Extreme, a collaboration tool that's part of NPS. When you listen to that, think of it as a much broader term, because this is the #1 job for enterprise CIOs. Reorganizing IT to raise productivity. Remember I said there was the problem. The problem that CIOs face, enterprise CIOs faced last year, was that costs in IT were fixed when business volumes were variable. Little wonder there's interest in cloud. Little wonder there's interest in as-a-service provision of printing or whatever else the service provider is. Because we are trying to move to a much more variable model where we can scale IT down and up as business volume dictates. That's why CIOs are interested in this. And then finally, raising business productivity by more than 10%. Well, managed print services will reduce the cost of printing between 10 and 30% of printing. In some industries, as Pierre has already pointed out, printing is a substantial component of cost, the law, part of the financial services business and so on. So if you're looking for a reduction of 10%, a pretty good place to start is looking at something that people are bad at doing, is poorly managed, mostly because they don't have the skills and focus, and that's the print fleet and the print that most of us don't even notice. That is a 10 to 30% cost reduction. That brings about a 10% improvement in business process performance. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why what you're hearing today is relevant to enterprise CIOs. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy.